All right, so now we're going to use the quadratic formula to actually solve. And so remember the quadratic formula looks like this. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So that's your formula. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to substitute our values in. So we're going to substitute our values into the equation. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to just do the discriminant part. So I'm going to write find discriminant. Which remember is the b squared minus 4ac part. And then we're going to simplify and write our two solutions. And maybe I won't say two, write the solutions. Sometimes you're only going to have one, sometimes you'll have two. So just a couple things to remember. Remember to put parentheses around a number before you square it. And if there's a negative number under the square root, then you're going to have an I. All right, and that's the whole two imaginary solutions. So as we do this again, we're going to plug it into the formula. If you can simplify, I usually do that first. So like if I look at example, which will be our first example, but if I look at this, I can divide a 2 out of everything. And the reason I like to do that is because it makes my numbers that I plug into my formula smaller. So 3m squared minus 5m minus 8 equals 0. And so this is our a value, our b value, and our c value. So when I go to plug it in, that's my first step. So I'm going to go x is equal to, and I go negative b. So right now it's negative 5. So I'm going to do the opposite of that, which is 5, plus or minus the square root, and then it's b squared. So negative 5 squared minus 4 times a times c. And then that's going to be all over 2 times a, which is 3 in this case. And so then I get x is equal to 5 plus or minus, and like I said, find the discriminant part first, and the rest of it's just going to stay there for a sec. So we're going to plug that in. So over here. Oops. There we go. All right, so we're going to plug in parentheses, negative 5 squared. And then it will be minus 4 times 3 times negative 8. And so we get 121. So that's the number that's going to go underneath. And so that's that first step I said, or second step. Find the discriminant. And then if it comes out nice, like this one comes out nice, so I can just do the work. So we're going to get x is equal to 5 plus or minus, when I simplify, square root of 121 is 11 over 6. And so what this does is it breaks it into two problems. We get 5 plus 11 over 6, and then we have 5 minus 11 over 6. And again, if you need to use a calculator, go ahead. If not, we're just going to go 5 plus 11, which is 16 over 6. And then 5 minus 11 is negative 6 over 6, which is going to give us negative 1. And then 16 over 6, you can reduce that, or you can write that as a decimal. I think on your assignment, they have you write it, as a decimal. But you might want to just double check that. It's a possibility that and you'll be able to see that. They're going to tell you, like they'll say round it to whatever place value. So this is 2.666 forever. So a couple things. If you write it as a decimal, if it tells you to write it as a decimal, then I would as a fraction, I would leave it as 8/3. If it tells you to write it as a decimal, then they're going to tell you what place value, which would probably be, I would assume, the hundredths place. So we get 2.67. So those are my two solutions. I've got -1 is one solution and 2.67 is the other solution. And notice how we have, that's a positive 121, so it makes sense that we have two real solutions. If I look at example 6, kind of the same thing. I'm going to divide out by 2 because 2 goes into everything. And I'm going to do a -2 just to keep that first number positive. It doesn't really matter. So then I get 3r squared plus r minus 2 equals 0. And so now when I go to plug that in, I've got a is 3, b is 1, c is -2, and then we're going to go from there. So again, we've got r this time because that's my variable. So r is equal to, and then we're going to go b with -b. So in this case, we have +1, so it's going to be -1 plus or minus the square root. Stop looking at me. B squared. So that's 1 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So a is 3 again. And so again, we're going to do the discriminant part first. And the bottom is 2 times 3, which is 6. And so we're going to, in our calculator, going to just plug that in. So we're going to clear that out. And so we've got 1 squared. And I'm not putting that one in parentheses because it's a positive. Minus 4 times a times c. And so we get 25. So that's a nice number. We're going to put it in here. And then from here, we've got -1. We're going to take the square root of 25, which is 5, divide by 6. And again, that's going to break down into our two problems. So we have -1 plus 5 over 6 and -1 minus 5 over 6. And so we're going to get 4 over 6. And we're going to get -6 over 6. And so when we get our two values, 4 over 6 is the same thing as 2/3. Which is going to give us 0.67 if we're going to write it as a decimal. And we get r is equal to -1. So those will be our two solutions. If we're asked to write it as a decimal, do the 0.67. If not, then just do 2/3. But the steps are pretty much the same each time. Notice that example 7 does not have a number we can divide. So this is A, B, C. It's set equal to 0, so we're good. And then we just plug it in. So again, our first step is to put it into our equation. So it's -b, so -5 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. And we just plug it in. Again, I always do the discriminant separate because it makes my life easier. Because if that's a negative number or something that doesn't come out nice, if I put it into my calculator from like with the root sign, then I end up with an error and I have to redo it anyway. And so it's just easier if you guys can do that as a separate step and then go from there. So we're going to do 5 squared minus 4 times 8 times 12. And again, if that first number, that b value, if that's a negative, you have to put parentheses around it. So this gives you -359. And notice that it's a negative. So remember, when it's a negative, that means that we've got an I situation going on there. And so if this is -359, I can try breaking 359 up, but I don't know if we can get a pair out of it anyway. But this little guy right here, the -1 means that I have an I. And so when that happens, and I go to simplify this, I've got -5 plus or minus I root 359 over 16. And that's actually my solution. I'm not going to be able to go any further than that because you have an I. And usually if you have an I, you're not going to be able to, you don't write it as a decimal because it's not real. And so if I was to put this in, we're going to go -5 plus I root 359 over 16, and then -5 minus I root 359 over 16. 359 we can't break down into any factors that we can pull out. But if that was like, let's say that was 24 or something, and you could break it down, then you have to. So kind of be careful there, because we don't, in this case, we didn't break it down, but we could. In this case, if we look at example 8, we've got A, B, and C. We can't divide anything out, so we're just going to go and put it in our equation. So we go -b, so the opposite of -8 is +8, plus or minus the square root, and then it's -8 squared. Notice because it's a negative, I put it in parentheses, -4 times A times C. So if you are confused with that part, I would just say always put that in parentheses. I get a little bit lazy with that because I know if it's a positive and I square it, it's fine. But when you have a negative, you don't have that option. You have to put it in parentheses when you put it in the calculator. So 8 plus or minus, we're going to figure out what goes in that little box. And 2 times 10 is 20. And then we pull up our calculator. And we're going to do parentheses because it's a negative. So -8, close our parentheses, square it, -4 times A times C. And so we get a negative number. So this is -136. And then because it's a negative, we're going to break that down. So this is -1 and 136. 136, we could either do 2, we could do 4, but all we're doing is dividing that. So if I do 136, let's just divide by 4. So we get 4 and 34. So this is 2 and 2, and this is 2 and 17. So when I look to simplify, these have got broken down. And so when I look for a pair, because remember that's our step, is we're simplifying. So plus or minus, I have a pair of 2's. So a 2 is going to come out. And then I also have this little guy here, which is that -1. So an I is going to come out. And then what's left over is the 2 and 17, which is 34. And then you have 20 on the bottom. And then because this is in, 2 goes into all of those numbers, but we don't divide. Remember, we don't divide underneath the radical, but we get x is equal to 2 divides into this 4. 2 will go into that to leave I. And the 34 we don't divide into because that's like a little house that's protected. And then 20 divided by 2 is 10. And so if I was to put it in my calculator, I have 4 plus I root 34 over 10. And then 4 minus I root 34 over 10. And so those would be your two solutions. And so that's quadratic formula. It's not as bad as it looks. It's just a lot of calculator work and paying attention to signs because that's huge. So hopefully that's good. Let me know if you have any questions.